A couple things happened recently that made me reflect on the power of the mind and how karate really helps us access many faculties that we take for granted. I decided to suit up and go do some kata practice and maintain some of those skills from my mother style. But then I decided to see if I could remember a kata from my early training, which was in a more modern style. Many of you may recognize this one. I have not practiced this one in 30 years. But I remember my former teacher, Mr. Oshima, saying repeatedly that what you learn with your mind you soon forget, but what you learn with your body you never forget. Well, he was right, because there I was running through the whole thing just like it was yesterday. Although I was happy to find out that I could still do it, I was a little disappointed to find that my body was moving just like I was taught back in those days. We were not taught to visualize the application while we were training, and the emphasis in Shotokan was always on correct form. The performance was everything, but not the insight. After training in an older style that had not been modernized, I approached kata practice differently, and I have ever since. You see, at a certain point in time, I promised myself that I would not practice without strongly visualizing the applications of the movements I was doing and visualizing my invisible attacker. And yet, when I did the movements that I was taught before making this decision years ago, I started slipping back into that old performance style of moving rather than a realistic style of moving. Now let's think about this for a moment. This means that wherever those moves are stored in the brain, they are bound to a certain aesthetic and a certain idea. It seems that you feel a certain way and you move a certain way when the right sequence is done according to the way you learned it. It's like a telephone number that's only the right combination of numbers will reach the right person. Or maybe it's like a song that you associate with a happy time, and then you feel happy again anytime you listen to it. I think this is a fairly universal experience. In this case, the kata sequences of my former style were connected to a vague idea about the application of the movements and the need to show speed, power, and good form. The movements of my later training are very obviously connected to their application in self-defense. They are what you might call a dress rehearsal for combat. Now, this is not to say that I believe the one kata is realistic and the other one is not. It's simply that at the time and place that I was taught the first one, the emphasis was on things other than self-defense. I'm sure there are people who can gain real ability from practicing that same kata only with a different mindset or learning it from a different teacher. I'm not here to compare styles. Stay with me for a moment while I talk about a movie. No, it's not a martial arts movie. I'm talking about the classic 1944 film Lara, which many of you older karate hackers may have seen. For those of you who are not familiar with it, it's the story of a police detective named Mark McPherson who's investigating the murder of a woman named Lara. He sifts through the clues in her apartment where she was murdered and becomes increasingly drawn to a portrait of her on the wall. He finds himself falling in love with the dead woman from her picture. We see him sitting in her living room taking slugs of scotch and gazing at the picture. Now, I want to call your attention to the interesting three-sided bottle on the table he's drinking from. The sides look as if they were pinched in when the glass was still soft. I spotted this when I watched the movie as a kid, and I commented on it. My mother said, "Oh, that's Pinch." I later found out that this was a brand of scotch that was popular when she was young. By the way, the plot thickens when suddenly Laura comes into her apartment alive, and the case becomes more complicated because someone else was murdered. What does this have to do with anything? Well, I was on my way to the liquor store recently, and I drove past a building that has been empty for a long time. When I was growing up, it used to be a gun shop. And for some reason, I have not been able to remember the name of that shop, in spite of racking my brains for a couple years. Probably for the same reason I can't remember anything else. But I drive by it frequently, always thinking it's going to come to me. And it never does. It's like the name of that gun shop has been mislaid on some shelf in my brain, and so much other stuff has been stacked that you can no longer see that one bit of information. Well, while I was in the liquor store, I glanced over, and what do you think I saw? A bottle of Pinch. I'm not a scotch drinker, but I always thought it was really an attractive bottle, so I decided to get one. After all these years, I possessed the bottle from the movie. And I had friends visiting, which kind of justified the purchase. I had to sample a little bit of it myself. Anyway, on my way back from the liquor store, I drove past the empty building again, as I have for years, and suddenly I remembered the name. Why? The name of the business had been McPherson's Gun Shop, the same name as the detective in the movie who was drinking the scotch. Do you see what happened? I could not access that bit of information until I had the right telephone number assembled in the right order to make that phone call to my memory banks. The scotch reminded me of the movie, that reminded me of the character's name, and the fictional character let me remember the name of the shop. Isn't that interesting? So, since that's how memories and information are stored in the mind, and it's obvious you need a clear trail back to them to be able to access them, then that reinforces what I'm always saying about effective karate training. It is a waste of time and effort in training just to look right, unless you do it for exercise or sport. But if you depend on this stuff for self-protection, you want the most ability with the least investment. After all, isn't that why you cook on your gas range instead of gathering wood to make a fire? And don't be conned into thinking that thousands of repetitions gives you that ability, without those repetitions being anchored to a particular idea or picture in your head. It's not dancing. You need to rehearse those situations where your life is in danger. Empty-headed repetitions don't deliver that. A few repetitions done the right way, often, will give you ability that you don't lose. The phone number you don't call very often, you will forget. The number you call every day, you never forget, even if you only call once a day. Got it? You don't have to call 20 times a day to remember that number. Same thing with training. In the Common Sense Self-Defense course, we use an accelerated learning technique to master short, to-the-point defensive maneuvers that almost anyone can do. It uses an incredibly brief amount of time practicing, as long as you call that number a couple times a week. Okay, see all you karate hackers later. In the meantime, see if you can find some triggers to your memories to explore how the mysterious karate-powered brain works.